Greetings and salutations. This is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, here with a review of a Swords of Northshire custom Wakizashi. A little bit about me before I get started on the review. I'm a geek who enjoys collecting functional swords. I focus mainly on swords inspired by medieval European blades, although I have a developing interest in Japanese-style blades as well. I don't have any real qualifications for talking about these swords, however. I've just started taking some classes in the use of European swords, but I recently hurt my elbow, so those are on hold after only the most basic of introductions. And I have no training at all in the use of Japanese swords. What I do have is a decent number of swords and a growing knowledge about them. If that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing to my channel. This Wakizashi, which my wife purchased for $225 US, is part of a his and hers daisho, with a his katana and hers Wakizashi. I've already reviewed the katana on this channel, and now it's time for the Wakizashi. Since this is kind of part 2 of that review, I'm going to skip the discussion about who Swords of Northshire is, where the blades are made, and such, and focus just on the Wakizashi. If you'd like to know more about those details, I'd encourage you to check out the katana review. At the end of this review, with both parts of the daisho complete, I'll give my overall thoughts on Swords of Northshire's custom Japanese swords. Alright, let's kick off this review by taking a look at the Koshirae. I didn't see anywhere on Swords of Northshire's website where they describe the material the Koshirae are made of, but I suspect it's either brass or an inexpensive zinc-based alloy. In any case, they are clearly cast, and the casting details are okay at best here. If you look at the outside of the floral designs, the edges are fairly crisp, but when you look at the details more, things start getting sloppy. The mold for this Koshirae has clearly been remade and well used. That said, my wife loves flowers, so this was the perfect design for her, and the gold and silver paint are attractive and relatively well applied. The fit of the Koshirae is frankly atrocious. First off, there's extremely prominent ledges on both sides of the ska where the Koshirae sticks out from the ito. On a Wakizashi, intended primarily for one-handed use, it's probably not going to cause any biting into the hand, since I don't think many techniques would call for the hand to be all the way down at the Koshirae, but it's still just really poor quality control. Worse than that, however, is how loose the Koshirae is. It wiggles around with even the slightest touch. With repeated use, I'm positive this would cause the ito knot to unravel. I'm not sure exactly when this looseness began. I didn't notice it when we first received the Wakizashi. Now I imagine it's not uncommon for a Koshirae to come loose after a good amount of use, especially against hard targets. However, it's cut probably around 4 pool noodles and 15 to 20 water bottles at most. Hardly what anybody would consider heavy impact targets. And not very much use either. Frankly, it's not alright that it's this loose. Moving on from the Koshirae, the ska is a pretty basic shape without any wasting or tapering. It's a comfortable shape, and the artificial silk ito is tightly wrapped. It doesn't really budge even with a good amount of force. The kata tamake style wrap holds the manuki far better than my custom katana. They barely budge on this one. The Samigawa panels are pretty much what you'd expect on a budget katana. Simple, inexpensive panels that look nice enough, but don't have any real distinguishing features. One of the mikugi is underneath a knot, and the other is splintered on one end and looks pretty bad, which is unfortunate considering my wife forbade me from disassembling this Wakizashi. The quality of this mikugi is pretty shameful. Swords of Northshire did include several replacement mikugi, and they don't look as bad, so maybe I'll sneak this one out of the handle and put one in that doesn't look like it was gnawed on. Don't tell my wife. Moving on to the Fuchi, it matches the Koshirae in looks and in quality. The details in the casting are not particularly sharp or well defined, but they're not terrible. Happily, it fits on the ska much better than the Koshirae. There's no wiggle at all, and while there is a tiny ledge on one side, it's barely noticeable even with close inspection, and it didn't bother me in use at all. The tsuba continues the floral theme, with half looking like a garden fence. Again, the casting quality here is decent at best, and the gold and silver paint application is alright. There's no sharp edges that bothered my hand during use, and the tsuba is nice and tight. The habaki and tsuba are presumably brass, and my wife selected a silver look to match my katana. I assume this silver look is accomplished by nickel plating. The tsuba otherwise are very generic. You'll see this type on the vast majority coming out of Longchuan, China. The fit of the habaki to the blade is quite good on one side, there's hardly any gap at all. On the other side, it's not nearly as good though, with a gap that's considerably larger. Let's take a look at the saya next. It's a wood core without a ton of dimension. The overall shape doesn't really taper in any appreciable way. The shiny black lacquer is pretty and applied fairly evenly, although there is some rippling on the surface. Being this shiny, it's a magnet for fingerprints. It also has some decoration inlaid into the lacquer. I'm not sure if this is depicting a garden or bamboo theme, or perhaps an aquatic one with coral. Either way, it looks nice, it seems to be well executed, and it doesn't affect the use of the saya at all. It looks like the koiguchi might be made of a different material than the wood core. It has a different grain than the wood. It might be horn, or it could just be a separate piece of wood. I don't really know how to tell. In any case, the shaping here is actually quite well done. The filing is very even and clean, and there's none of the black gunk you sometimes see in cheap sayas. As a comparison, here's an example of a much worse execution from a recently acquired katana. You can immediately see how much cleaner and better the Wakizashi's koiguchi is. The fit of the Wakizashi to the saya is pretty much perfect. There's no discernible rattle, the retention is exactly where I want it, and it's easy to draw the sword. Now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. Like the katana, this is 1060 high carbon steel that is through hardened. The hamon is wire brushed on, as opposed to a byproduct of clay tempering and polishing. The blade has my wife's name, Jenny, etched into it in katakana. The blade is a representation of a shinogi zukuri, which is the most common blade geometry for a katana. Something rather unusual is the bohi, which would normally start within the nakago. My wife chose for it to start after her name instead. The lines of the bohi are clean and straight, although the surface inside does show a small amount of rippling. The planes of the rest of the sword are smooth, however, no ripples at all. The yokote is not geometric. There's no change to the blade shape here. It's just a line where they use a different type of polish. It looks decent enough, and the line is a lot crisper than on my katana. And the kasaki overall is generally well formed. The tip is nice and acute. The mirror polish on this blade is already showing some discolorations. These marks appeared during a cutting session. I had cut about 5 water bottles over the course of 2 to 3 minutes, and went to dry the blade off when I noticed it had already developed these tiny bits of what I assume are the beginning of rust. This surprised me. Sure, water on blades causes rust, that's why I keep my blades oiled, but I've never seen it appear so rapidly. I think they'd be pretty easy to polish out since they're very minor. There's also 2 small flaws near the spine on one side. These look like they're actually small pits in the metal, and they were there from the beginning. The Wakizashi came sharp, and the edge is good and even throughout. It's not quite as sharp as my katana, but it's sharp enough to do the job. So that brings me to cutting performance. Unfortunately, I only have video of me cutting one pool noodle. I haven't been able to get more since my elbow injury, so we'll have to make do with this older footage. Please keep in mind, I'm a complete novice when it comes to cutting things with a sword. The Wakizashi cut through the pool noodle quite easily, producing clean cuts most of the time. There was some tearing at parts, that's probably my fault though. It's agile, easy to maneuver, and it's fun to cut with. So now it's time to talk bottom line. Was the Wakizashi worth the price? Well, that's going to blend into my thoughts about Swords of Northshire's custom katana line as a whole. As I mentioned in the katana review, I'm not much of a fan of most of the Koshirae offered here, including those on this Wakizashi. I much prefer more subdued themes. The vast array of options just doesn't mean much to me. On both my katana and my wife's Wakizashi, there are highs and lows. The katana's manuki are unacceptably loose, while the casting quality of the Koshirae was better than expected, and the fit and finish in general was pretty good. The Wakizashi has a very tight Ito wrap, but the casting quality is worse, and it's the Koshirae that's far too loose. That to me is a much bigger problem, as it would lead to the ska becoming unusable without a rewrap. Taking all this into consideration, my general thought is that Swords of Northshire's custom Japanese-style blades are not quite worth the price. The blades themselves seem to be of decent to good quality, but there's some quality control issues with the fit and finish. I don't expect to buy another Swords of Northshire sword, as I don't think the quality is quite up to snuff. That said, this is just my opinion, and it's heavily influenced by my dislike of the vast majority of the Koshirae on offer. Most of it strikes me as garish. The tastes differ, and what I find overly flashy, others will love. So if you're looking to get a functional katana made with a specific style of Koshirae for a budget price, and you don't plan on using it to any great degree, Swords of Northshire might be right for you. I do think they offer an interesting service that I'm sure appeals to a lot of people. It's just not for me. So that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you so much for watching. If you happen to enjoy it, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Feel free to leave any comments you might have as well. Until next time, Alien Toot out.